Warm welcome to all early birds in Almedalen, kickstarting this exciting week we have ahead with this exciting seminar. I would just like to say, we are in Almedalen, I'm Swedish, and I will not try to sound like ABBA making this interview, so please bear with me. And if you haven't provided yourself with coffee and cinnamon bun, jump out and get some coffee and a cinnamon bun. So, and some practical details. We will have an exciting conversation in about 40 minutes, and we will finalize with Q&As, and we will pass around papers. So if you have questions you don't want to pose yourself, Annika is waving down there. Pass the paper to her, and we will make sure to grasp all your reflections at the end of the seminar. Having said that, please let me introduce this exciting panel, Giants on Sustainability, all of you. We are especially happy that you, Georg Kell, have come all the way to Almedalen and honor us with your presence in this seminar. You worked formerly as the first and executive director of the UN Global Compact, and now you lead the work at Arabesque with full heart for sustainability, driving the agenda forward. And then we have Jens Henriksson, the CEO of Folksam, a mutual insurance company with a long-standing engagement for sustainable business operations. And we are very happy that you also could make this panel.
Thank you.
And then Elisabeth Dahlin, the Secretary General of Save the Children, for 10 years now, with a long-standing engagement for sustainable business operations. You were the first CSR ambassador, among many things. So I think we have an exquisite panel here. And we will focus on AI driving human rights. How is that possible? This seminar is organized by Arabesque and Save the Children as a joint venture. So, I would like to start with you, Georg. Could you please inspire us by sharing the story on how Arabesque's methodology works and how that in itself can contribute in driving the questions on human rights forward? Please.
Thank you, and good morning. Great to be here. Just very briefly, by way of reinforcing what you just articulated, the global trend is very clear that technology and digitalization increasingly pushes for transparency and less allows corporates to hide something deep down there or back there. That means more and more corporations worldwide understand that it makes sense to be proactive rather than defensive. There are still many companies who are sitting on a fence, no doubt, or are very early in their journey, but digitalization, datafication increasingly means from the corporate perspective that it also makes business sense to be proactive on issues that used to be quite strange to them. Human rights and business. You may ask, isn't human rights the job of governments? Yes, it is. But does have business a role and a responsibility? Absolutely. And as the influence and role of business has grown over the years, as business has gone global, has built up value chains, you can argue not only on moral grounds that power and responsibility can ultimately not be separated, but there is increasingly also a business case for actually cultivating an agenda around human rights. It starts at the workplace, in the community, in the supply chain. Now, finance has been the laggard in this equation. Corporates have been pushed forward, backwards, and they have slowly and are still in the process of changing. But finance until recently only looked at the narrow financial bottom line, short-term shareholder value maximization, everything else. They couldn't even measure it. They couldn't put a tag on it. They couldn't quantify it. Now a big breakthrough is happening worldwide, and I'm very proud to be with Arabesque, which basically, by the way, means the beauty of symmetry in nature, where increasingly with big data you can look through the corporate organization and you can identify where weaknesses and strengths, including and especially on issues that relate to sustainability. And this is a major breakthrough because it means the world of finance increasingly can put a positive or negative premium on corporates' behavior in these areas. And if finance is aligned and supportive of good practices, then the theory and the practice suggests us change can happen much faster. The technology which we developed, and some of it making freely available, is called S-Ray Sunshine. It uses hundreds of millions of data points to shine a light on the corporate DNA. And we believe it will be a catalytic impact on this development, because finance is then finally aligned with what corporates are doing or not doing. And it's a big thing in my view, because it means market-led changes will accelerate. They will transform markets, what you could call from the old thinking, where business didn't really care about what's outside their factory gates or outside their immediate sphere of influence, towards a future where they increasingly are seeking and supporting a supportive community, a positive affinity with people, and where they proactively, within their own organizations, integrate especially important issues around the children's rights agenda. So I think there's a big story in the making, provided, I should add, that the political systems within which markets function stay stable, and that openness and the rule of law is respected also in the future. I would argue there is a risk currently in the global marketplace all over that we are going into a more anarchic, protectionist, me first only attitude, which would do a lot of damage to a lot of things. It would destroy this agenda, and it would also destroy humanity's ability to make progress and to create value across the chains everywhere. And here again, human rights, children's rights, I believe, are one way of countering that, because when you uphold the positive actions, you can clearly show that, look, we want to improve the situations. And so, provided the political framework stays stable, this agenda here of finance and children's rights and business practices is bound to make huge leaps forward into the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Georg. If you were to answer a question from me, I was thinking of if you were to describe the stakeholders needing to have hands on deck for a sustainable future, who would you say is the key stakeholder? You touched on it, but would you please further your thoughts a bit, moving this needle for a sustainable future better forward?
Well, in the past, the corporate movement has largely looked at non-governmental organizations. It had this stakeholder theory, which is good and very important, and we are in a stakeholder world now, but the stakeholder notion now is much wider. It's basically a people's notion. You have to be able to relate to individual citizens through your actions. And so it's really the new challenge is to connect with people directly. And we have to reconnect on the value side. What does it mean to live in an ethical world? What does it mean to make choices? What is right and what is wrong? We have to rediscover that and refresh it almost on a daily basis, because humanity forgets. We forget the lessons of history. We forget what is right and wrong. And if we do not challenge ourselves and challenge everybody around us, we always fall the risk of repeating mistakes of the past, as historians would call it. So I would claim today the stakeholder notion is a much wider one. It is actually a citizen's notion.
And if you were to stretch that just one bit further, am I hearing right? You think of consumers as those setting the agenda?
Oh, absolutely. In the market context, obviously, we call people consumers, but every consumer is also a citizen, and every citizen also votes, and every citizen also leaves a footprint in their own life with their family and whatever they're doing. So I would go very inclusive now. I think we have moved from a top-down, more centralized conceptualization of this world into now a really bottom-up world, and social media, obviously, and all that has facilitated this. But in this transition to a total free bottom-up world, I claim we have lost some of the moral orientations, or we are in search for reorientation. So we have to search for good ethics, for human rights from the bottom up again. And when we do that, obviously we want to leverage what has been done in the past, but build on it with an eye to consumers, citizens.
What a beautiful bridging to Elisabeth, Georg. How can we create that bottom-up and the ethic perspective, adding a child rights lens into business operations as part of how you set the business operations as responsible? So please, Elisabeth, would you like to introduce our engagement and the children's rights and business principles and all we do?
I'd be happy to. And just to start with, to say, for Save the Children, to realize children's rights, we have to see which actors are the ones that can be behind the transformative process. Governments can do their parts. The NGOs can do their parts. But we see in many ways with the challenges that we'll come back to later for children in the world today, the corporate sector can do so much more and they can do it quicker and hopefully in a smarter way. It is a joy to listen to you, Georg. We've been comrades in arms since 2005 when I was on the board of the UN Global Compact. And I get so inspired. You're a true thought leader. Because with the UN Global Compact, we started to see the whole sphere of influence of corporates, the whole work of John Druggy on the human rights and business principles. And actually, the child rights and business principles, I think we are co-midwives. We started out it was during the inauguration of President Obama's first administration in the US. We had a coffee. I was new in Save the Children, and for Save the Children, it's essential that we do not look at corporates as only philanthropy or charity. That is fine. This is not what we're talking about. This is about a core business. We had a chat and said human rights so often involves children. That was the birthplace of the child rights and business principle. And without your thought leadership, it wouldn't have been there. And I think now with the big data, it's the next step. Global Compact was the first. Now we are seeing the real big changes. And we are learning from history, but we're also looking into the future. And childhood matters. And I think that is something we have to think about. And what we do to children today, that will shape their society for them tomorrow. And in a very truly sustainable society, every child can thrive or develop wherever you live, whoever your parents are. And we can also look at that as the best interest, not only of the child and of the society. It doesn't matter if you're a child in child poverty in Europe or if you are a child in child labor in India. We have to think strategic when it comes to children, and we have to see, again, which actors can make the change in the children's life. And if we really want to do it strategically, we have to look at the actors, but we also have to get the facts right. So we know what is happening, as you rightly said. We are always looking into the back mirror rather than forward-looking. And that's why we need the big data. And what happens to children today, that shapes their lives tomorrow. If you don't have good ways of upbringing, you probably won't get the chances they have the right to do. And if we want to create a truly sustainable future, it is vital that children's needs and children's rights are identified as a point of departure for all initiative when it comes to businesses and societies. And I think this has been incredibly interesting in one of the world's most challenging markets in China. We set up a fully owned by Save the Children FDI in 2008. We now have 17 full-time employees that only work with the core business of businesses in China. And we are now expanding to the rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia. And who are the ones, the demandeurs? These are the companies. This is not an NGO work. This is strategic work to change the lives of children through the cooperative sector. And I'd just like to give, do we have the slides so we can get the big data?
Unfortunately not.
Okay, so I'll take them more. No, but I mean, and that's why it comes to, the thought leadership and the next steps. What do we see with the big data? I mean, one can claim children has never had it as good in the world as they have it today. And that is good. That's thanks to the Millennium Goals, that with the global goals. But we can also see the dividends between the different groups of children, between the ones left behind and the ones that have. And if you look, there's a lot of children that do not live in poverty anymore. Child mortality has dropped tremendously in Malawi, in Ethiopia, even in Bangladesh. But we are still seeing a lot of child labor. 152 million children are in child labor, and a large group of them are in hazardous child labor, that kind of labor that children should not have. And a lot of countries do not have children that actually go to school. And I think that's another problem where we need the big data. Because a lot of the world's NGOs and governments and corporates, mind you, they said we will not employ anybody under 18. Fine. Now, if you live in Pakistan, half of the kids don't finish 4th grade. They are on the streets or on the fields. These are the kids working in the informal sector. They are selling anything from chewing gums to their own bodies. They are not getting a step into social protection. How can we, together with corporates, find ways of shaping an inclusive society where children can get a training, but they can also get paid and they can get their own money and they're not being abused by others? It's a huge challenge. It's very hard. We are challenging a lot of the NGO world by putting this at the forefront. But even here, I think we need, what you say, this thought leadership. Do we want to have 50 million kids on the streets? No. We have to change the way that we think, and that's why we need all the big data. And 1/3 of the world's population today are children. If we don't give them the chances they have the right to, they will not have a future. I think also if you look again at China, do you know how many children who wake up without mom and dad every morning? 62 million kids. Parents have left to get work, to get a cash income, but because of Chinese laws, the children are not allowed to accompany the parents to the big cities, to the workplaces. At the best, these kids are staying with grandma and grandpa. At the worst, they're just left behind. This is a huge problem for the children. It's a huge problem for society, for the parents, and also for the corporates. And I think that is a beautiful example where corporates can step in and say, if we can make sure that the kids actually are well protected, it's good for the child, it's good for the families, it's good for the company, it's good for the society. And I think there's these narratives we have to think about when we look at the big data. What is transformative? What will actually change the lives of kids? And when we look at kids who are 6 years old today, 2030, when the global goals are supposed to be implemented, they will be adults. So it's not a lot of time. We only have 12 years to go. So what we do here and now will impact them. And I will finalize by quoting Alice Miller. And she said, you might think of childhood and adolescence as the shortest part of a person's life. But it's on the contrary, it's the longest, since everything that you experience growing up, you will carry with you for the rest of your life. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisabeth. I think I'm looking at the clock. I think I will jump directly to you, Jens. You are our business voice here on stage. You have a long-standing commitment for sustainability. Folksam, where you are the CEO, has been driving the sustainable agenda for decades. What are your reflections and thoughts now when you have listened to Georg on the AI and to Elisabeth on the children's rights and business aspect? Maybe it can add value to the agenda setting for a CEO. What are your reflections and thoughts, please?
Well, let me start by saying thank you for being invited. This is the seminar I've been looking forward to in Almedalen, and there are many reasons for that. One is, of course, I think the work you do at Save the Children is great and is important, and it's also George, with your background in Global Compact, which we have been involved in for a very long time. Arabesque is a new acquaintance, and let's see if we can do something with them as well. But the reason why I'm been looking forward to this has been the combination of sustainability and AI. And sustainability, as you rightly mentioned, we in Folksam has been involved in that for a long time. And AI, I wrote my thesis on AI, so I need to show off a bit first. I can't help. I mean, it's the first time. Nobody, when I did this in '92, nobody was interested. So now I can talk about it now. So that's life.
We listen.
So 2 things. First, AI. The idea with AI is that what you do is you create a mathematical model which sort of is a way of how the brain works. And the idea is that you do not program it, the computer, in the same way, and then you can use learning to see different patterns. The other thing is big data. Big data is a different thing. Big data is just a big collection of data, and with today's computers and today's warehouses, you can use that to find new patterns. I think it's important to say that these are neutral technologies. I mean, sometimes you talk about whether they're good or bad. Is a car good or bad? Is a bike good or bad? Who knows? It depends on what you use it for. When you come then to, you talked about, Lisa, you talked about China. So I'll give you one example. So in China, they have now 200 million surveillance cameras. They tell you that in 2 years from now, that will have tripled, and they will up to 600 million surveillance cameras. They have I think it's in 16 different cities. They've set up surveillance cameras. They use AI, and they use big data. So what they can see is they can look on everybody's faces and tell who's there with 99.8% accuracy. And they've used this to make a lot of arrests. So they've arrested over 2,000 people. Now, let's go back then to the human rights and to children's rights. Now, if you take human rights, one of the principles is that no one should be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy. So obviously, this is a break with human rights. But then you go to children's rights, and of course, I can promise you, around those 2,000 people, there are probably child offenders that you take off the street, which is then in the children's right, it said that you should take appropriate measures in order to save the children. So that's a way you can see it's neutral, but it depends on how you use it. So the first issue I would sort of say, and look to you, George, because you have background in the UN, is when will we see, we have human rights, we have children's rights, when will we have robots' rights? So that's the question to you.
Yeah.
When will the robots' rights and the robots' obligation, when will the United Nations take that decision? So that's the first thing. Now, what are then the sort of, what can we then bring back on this? Well, I would say that the main key point is what you said, George. No one can hide. It's that simple. You can't hide on the street. You cannot hide as a company. And so we as a company, we need to make sure that everything we do is possible for people to watch. And then we have two things as being a sort of insurance company. One is what we do in the everyday life. We have insurances, and that means that we need to think about how do we take care of repaired goods, how do we deal with claims, how do we deal with privacy, and all that things. And the other thing is we as investors. And we are one of the largest investors in Sweden. And what we've decided is that we do not want to invest in bad things. And that's what we worked for now, I would say, 40 or 50 years. And we've been pretty good on sort of deciding what to not invest in. Now, for us now comes the tricky part, and that is all the other companies are coming along, and they are trying to do the same thing as us. Well, I'm very happy for the world because of that, but I'm a little bit sad about Folksam, because that means that our competitive advantage is slowly disappearing. So what we now is trying to do is decide what to invest in, rather than not what we're not investing in. And what we will then is we will try to use, of course, the SDGs, because this cannot be only one of the goals. It needs to be all over. And then I think big data could be very important. So I think that's the conclusion. You can use big data for good things, you can use it for bad things. Transparency will be there all over the place.
Thank you, Jens. How inspiring.
You did not expect that.
I didn't. This was a great surprise.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Not the Folksam engagement, but your thesis was. So, Elisabeth, can I ask you to comment on Jens? We talked yesterday about WeChat and what we do with new technology in China through our center there. Could you just dwell on that and then link it to no one can hide, like Jens brought up here? A very important aspect on how sustainability can be a driver in the sustainable agenda.
Yeah, new technology and actually access for a lot of people. Because I think it was a very good example that you had on China, how it can be used as surveillance. We use it the other way, surveying the companies. And this, mind you, this is not paid by Save the Children. This is fee for service by the companies. But they have, and I can feel, when you talk about this surveillance, I can feel a bit dubious because WeChat is something between Twitter, Facebook, Swish, a number of other services. You can order taxis like all in one, which is fantastic access of information. But if it's surveyed, you will know exactly where Jens were or what Georg was doing yesterday.
But
if you
WeChat, the Chinese government is
yes.
looking totally into that.
Exactly. But we've been using WeChat because that's the only accessible technology for a lot of young workers. And everybody's complaining. If you listen to Chinese debate among corporates and also in the government and in the UN, people talk about, how about the new generation? Well, nobody has asked them. We've been working with the young workers, asking them, what are your wishes? What do you want to see in the future? What do you think is important? And then we can use the WeChat. And it was amazing to see because they grew up with parents who grew up under Mao Zedong. These are the iPhone generation. They have totally other dreams. They're totally different expectations on the employer and on life, etc., etc. And I think the WeChat has been amazing in using something that is partly controlling the population, but also using simple technology that is accessible for common people and the not so well-to-dos, and really to gather a lot of information and being able to show them. And what made me full of joy is when the China textile and apparel industry, the head of the one, a common friend of Georg and myself, happily says, oh, and you know, we did this survey. I said, you didn't, we did. But it's better that they own it, because then you can push the future for the young people, because nobody ever thought about talking to them. We've done the same with the parents. Nobody asked the migrant parents what the problem was. And the problem is for a lot of these, the kids of the 62 million kids left behind, they have kind of abdicated from being a parent. They don't know how to deal with the kids. So not only is the kid left behind, but they do not have parents. How can you help migrating parents to be parents? And even there we have done very innovative things. I'll be just 1 minute on that. With the companies, in all Chinese factories, you have this kind of drinking, smoking, karaoke room for men in the management. Together, after dialogue with the companies, these have been transferred into child-friendly spaces, the same as we would have in Jordan or in Lebanon for children on the move. Place where children can be children, where they can play, because now at the summer vacation, kids come to the factories. And there's no way a 4-year-old is going to sit next to a sewing machine. That is what happens. We've converted this into summer camps for the kids of migrating parents for 2 months. And I was in tears talking to a mum of a 5-year-old girl, and she said, you know, for the last 3 years, I've been locking her up in the dormitory because I was so afraid somebody would kidnap her or something would happen. For the first time in my life, I got to know my own daughter.
That's a brilliant example on how business can take on responsibilities for children through their own core business, securing staff to have a good relation with their children.
And looking at the data, what happened in these companies. The loyalty, the sentiment of the workers, not only of the parents that could bring the kids, but of the whole workforce. And that labor-place dialogue started through the children. So I think sometimes we can see offsprings of one activity that actually leads to other things. And I think that is innovative and it's transformative.
Georg, you waved and you wanted to comment on Jens and also on Elizabeth. So please, and I will just say, now time is running when you have a fun time on stage. So prepare your questions and we will have finalized with 5 minutes for that. But first, Georg, please.
Very quickly, just to build on what has been said, I totally concur with Jens about the need to define purpose and to be aware that technology is now moving so fast and society is not really catching up with it. It's almost outpacing our ability to digest how fast things are changing. And to give it a purpose and a direction is very important. The UN has come up with the Sustainable Development Goals, which give one North Star there. We have a rights-based concept. We have also the proactive agenda. I applaud Save the Children for their strategic partnerships with business. It's really a big thing. Breakthroughs on a scale, you know, we couldn't even dream about 10 years ago. And that work has to not only continue, but to scale up. But I want to bring us back just one on a realistic pedestal once again. I think despite the enormous progress on technology, we have not yet really made it happening to shine a light on social performance across the board. We still have a long way to go on the environmental side and also on the governance side. Within the finance community, we talk about these ESG, environmental, social governance factors. The environmental carbon decarbonization is moving quite fast and good progress. A lot more to be done, clearly, but at least the measurements and the concepts. On the governance as well. But on the social side, especially on the human rights and the children's rights, we still have to do much, much more. It's an issue that corporates often feel you're really not an exception, but you're among luckily there are more and more coming now. But a lot of CEOs, when they hear human rights, oh, what have I done wrong? They don't yet see that through their own practices, they can set powerful examples, and through good partnerships, they can really leverage a lot. So we still have a long way to go there. And in our big data approach, we focus now, among others, on the social side, on human rights. And we are quite ambitious. We hope by the end of the year, in a new form of collaboration, we will be able to deliver a quantification on human rights with a special focus on children's rights. We think the time for that has come. We have to fill that void. The social dimension within the ESG agenda, or sustainable responsible investing, is the weakest one so far. And filling that void also tackles some of the most difficult sustainable development goals that the world has agreed upon. So just as a forward-looking agenda. But this is work in progress. We're not yet there. Just to be realistic on this. And many corporates still have a lot of work to do, I would claim. There are front runners, there are those who move ahead, and there are luckily more and more following. But if you look at the bigger picture, there's still a lot of heavy lifting to do. And this is where SRAY, sustainable data, quantification, and hopefully quantification of children's rights will soon be another catalyst to push forward. Because from the corporate cost-benefit side, you know, getting it wrong is really bad. You do a lot of damage to your brand. You undermine your own morality. You diminish the motivation of your employees. You diminish your future fitness concept. If you get it right, you have high motivation, you have high performance, you have good ethical standards, and you actually also contribute to the betterment of the world at large.
And
Thank you, Geo. Jens, please.
Could I just say that I totally agree what you said. The basic point is that we know that every day we are watched, and that means that we need to make business in a sustainable way. And we're also used as a competitive advantage, both to sell our things and to make more money from our investments. We can get higher pensions because we invest in sustainability bonds rather than just government bonds. So we made money for our pensioners by doing good. And also, I think it's a very sort of important thing to attract competent labor, to get people to work at Folksam. I'm sorry to confess, we do not pay the highest wages in Folksam. But what we do is that we can promise you that you will work in a company that tries to deliver good for the customers every day. But back to my question. So when you have a background in United Nations, when will we see robots' rights coming out?
I would agree that this is one of the next big challenges. I started, by the way, at the Fraunhofer Institute working on AI 10 years before you.
Good. Yes.
But my knowledge is so outdated now as an engineer, and I was in 78. There were only 5 people in the world who looked into this. The others, it was the pre-runner to CAD/CAM and automation in manufacturing. But I realize I'm no longer, haven't followed that in detail in the tech, but I realize the world is not prepared yet for the question you're raising, but it's an increasingly important question. And we should push for it. And there is some, by default, if you follow the technology companies in the US and the stories they are forced to go through now, they have to answer partial questions to that. But it's only partial. And I applaud, by the way, Europe and Sweden, because you raised the issue of privacy. You are trying to start the debate, to raise the debate at least, what is private and what is public, what is publicly legitimate to be controlled versus where do I have an inherent right to protect my own personality. These are boundary questions that haven't been really sorted out yet. Yeah? And a lot of citizens or consumers are pretty naive. I mean, people love to embrace the new gadgets and everything connected, including in my bedroom and in my bathroom. Surprise, surprise. So this is a thing to come, but it's urgent. I would agree. And I would claim, as everything in human nature and technological change, we have to go back to values and purpose. We have to ask the deep questions again. How do we use it? What do we want to accomplish with it? In America, they do it by default. Everything goes until something goes wrong, and then there's class action lawsuits. Yeah. In Europe, in general, there's a precautionary approach to such issues. First, you have to bring the evidence that it doesn't do harm. Then you have a license. So where's the balance?
Yeah, could I follow up then to Elisabeth then, because I think that's the key point. You mentioned WeChat before. We know that the Chinese government sits with the key to WeChat. So of course you can say all the good things that happens, but the same thing, their security service will know which workplaces is there a tendency to have an uproar, who will be angry if you do that relocation over there. So it's a double-edged sword that you need to sort of keep track on.
Yeah, and I can only
Final
agree
comment
that
on
that double-edged sword. I mean, we're not only seeing, I mean, what's happening in China, and I think they're very more in signs of that, but we can see it in other parts of the world too, and that's what I think. I mean, it's interesting when robots' rights or control of data and the personal integrity, because it can lash back tremendously, and I think that is something we really have to bear in mind, and I think. The absurd thing, I've spent many years in Vietnam, where you actually have a very vivid internet conversation and a lot of opposition on the internet. But with the control that people have, they can easily put 100 people in jail on the same day. And I think that is something that we need to discuss also with the SDGs. Where is technology coming in, and what are the limits, and where does the personal integrity, children's rights and human rights come in?
That's the daunting backside of the fact that we disseminate information and share everything with each other, and some states and some others have other agendas. So important note, Jens, on keeping track on the human rights aspect of that. Okay, dear audience, is anyone sitting here with a question or a note? Yes, please. We have a microphone, Annika. Please introduce yourself with name and where.
My name is Agla. I'm actually a digital management student, and I have a thank you for bringing. But I'm also involved in the sustainability or svenska biståndsarbete. Thank you for bringing the AI to this forum. I have two questions. One of them is, if you talk about the transparency of and bringing companies accountable to in terms of social responsibility, have you considered the blockchain technology as one of the ways to achieve that? And the second question is, when we talk about AI, for the last year, one of the main challenges have been discovered. The social, gender, and racial biases that the technologies bring within, and the discussion started about how do we bring everyone's perspective into creating AI, not only using AI and data as a tool to help people or to work with people, but also who is behind creating the AI. So how do you bring children's perspective in this particular case into the realm of creating actually AI algorithms? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another question there, and looking at the watch, I think we have to please pose your question. And then one final question here, and then we will try to wrap up. Please.
Thanks. Just a quick question for Georg and Jens. Just wondering if you guys were actually already using AI, and if not, why not?
You and the lady up here. And please state your name.
Oh, sorry, I'm Dominic Robinson. I'm working for an AI company.
Okay. Please here, up here in the front. The lady here in the corner. You can.
Yes, I'm Fredrika Ornbrand, counterterrorism coordinator at the Minister for Foreign Affairs here in Stockholm. And of course, we're also struggling a lot about privacy and, for example, how to track foreign terrorist fighters that are returning to Europe, for example. But I was just wondering, you mentioned the UN, that the UN should take a more of responsibility in this field. What exactly would you like the UN to do to regulate or adopt convention? But it would be interesting to learn more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, audience. Now we have 5 exciting questions really relevant to our discussion. I look at the panel and who would like to start with the blockchain technology question?
I can do all.
Yeah?
Very
Could you
quick.
do all, please?
So I'll do very quick.
Yes.
So I start with Fredrika's question. I think that we have human rights, we have children's rights, now we have robust rights and robust obligations. So I think it should be convention 48, 89, and 2022 or something. I don't know. I'm guessing. So that's the first point. Second point about blockchain. We do not use blockchain. We are lagging behind. I think we want to go there. AI, is there a problem with sort of racial bias or gender bias? Yes, I agree. I'll give you an example. So everybody knows that, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to say something that's really bad now. Everybody knows that women drive better than men. And they have less car crashes. But we, as an insurance company, are not allowed to take lower premiums from women than men. Because that's a decision made by the European Union that you cannot have, you need to be gender equal when it comes to insurances.
Interesting.
Now, let's say that you use an AI system then to sort of look through the data, and they will come up with say, okay, so you need to have premiums higher for men than for women. Well, you cannot do that. Well, the problem with AI, it will find a way. It will say, okay, so those with high heels and long hair, it could be men, of course, now, but the key point is that you will find other ways of dealing with that. So I think what will happen is that AI, and then I'm getting back to the final question is, do we use it at Folksam? No, we do not. And I think the reason for that is that we are a regulated entity. So when it comes to pricing, when it comes to sort of these kinds of things, the FSA needs to go in and look on how does the sort of how are the mechanisms behind the price setting, and you cannot explain AI that. I think AI will be used mainly for us in the customer interaction, but we're not there yet. But I think in the near future we will look on different ways on how to interact with customers through voice and mail.
Thank you, Jens. I look at Annika, and we have 1.5 minutes to go, and then the next seminar want to decorate the stage. So please, Georg and Elisabeth, share, like you always do, your thoughts and reflections on this.
I will be very brief and only partially answer some of the questions. One is the most important one I'd like to reply to is I think you need a moral point of reference when you embark on new journeys. Without a moral North Star orientation, you get lost in opportunistic, possibly self-destructive undertakings. I have no doubt that's the story of human history, and we have the fundamentals. And I want to make some advertisement for the universality of the principles of the Global Compact, of human rights, of children's rights. That's why they are so important. And you should also make sure that AI, when they look into big data, and this is what we will do, we will specifically produce a product based on big data, a little bit with AI already, we'll discuss that later, but with a clear focus exclusively on these reference points. I think we humans need a moral orientation, otherwise we totally get lost in chaos.
Thank you, and Elisabeth. Final
very
words.
finally, child participation, and it must be ethical and relevant. It cannot be tokenist. Children must be able to express their voices and sometimes have solutions that we haven't even been thinking about. And I'm just thinking about all the child rights networks that we have around the world to engage organized children, so you don't just get the most well-behaved kid in class giving the input, because then it's not real participation. And secondly, I think on the AI, if we want to change the world for children, if we really want to be transformative, we have to be forward-looking, and that's why we are so happy to work together with Arabesque and others, and based on the UN conventions, to really see when can we make the big changes for children's rights, who can do it, and how can we accelerate that process. And that's why we are here.
Thank you, everyone. And I think Georg's moral North Star, let's take that with us from this seminar. as an ethical point of view when we onwards march for sustainable developments from a business perspective, civil society's perspective, and asset management with a global reach like Arabesque. The global North Star for sustainable development must shine a light on all of us. So thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you for all your relevant and very interesting questions. We have to join hands and continue this important aspect. AI and human rights, they are linked and intertwined. So thank you.
Thank you.
Can I give you? No, okay.